welcome to the second of our mostly Monday night Insight Lectures with Jim Earl speaking on Arabic love poetry. When I learned that I'd be introducing Jim, I got right to work, titling this, Thinking About Jim Earl, an intellectual love poem after the Arabic. It had a really promising beginning. How I wish I could split my brain with a knife, put Jim inside, then close up my head. And I had just finished that dazzling first stanza when Jim wrote to warn me that my introduction had to be brief and real. So I abandoned the poem, but kept thinking about Jim Earl as a short, factual expression for getting to the heart of tonight's speaker. Only Jim would publish an important study about an Old English epic poem, Thinking About Beowulf, without so much as a word of jargon or even a colon in the title. Only Jim would so audaciously emphasize the thinking part of scholarship and communicate this in elegant, lively, lucid prose. In his introduction to the book, he says that what holds the chapters together is the intellectual pleasure I have found in thinking about Beowulf. A recent scholarly forum on Jim's book affirms that a decade after its publication, quote, "It is still remarkable and unique in Beowulf studies and even in Old English studies more generally," close quote. Now, Jim Earl is a consummate scholar, and his writing and teaching are always deepened by his engagement with ethical issues. But what I found most magical about his mind, and what I'm sure underlies his literary work and his ethical commitments, is the intellectual pleasure he takes in reading, writing, teaching, translating, in creating and guiding the Insight Seminar program, and really in every endeavor. He's also a visual artist and a darn good cook. In addition to his study of Beowulf, Jim has published dozens of essays on Anglo-Saxon literature and culture, the Bible, psychoanalysis and literature, ethics, Indian novels, and Bob Dylan, to mark just a few points along his wide spectrum of work. He edited The World of Literature with 4 colleagues, and he has a book forthcoming called Beginning the Mahabharata, a reader's guide to the framed stories. Among his many honors are the Beatrice White Prize for the Best Article on Medieval Literature in 1991, and Williams, Freeman, Rippey, and Westling Awards for teaching, research, and leadership. He has co-directed the Medieval Studies program, and he became something of a culture hero for faculty when he courageously and tirelessly worked for reform in intercollegiate athletics as president of the Faculty Senate in 2000 and as a member of the UO President's Task Force on Athletics in the following years. So you see, Jim is not only a thinker but a doer. As our presence here shows, he got away from his desk and reached out to other thinkers in the community by launching the Insight Seminars in 2002, and is now broadening even that audience with these free evening Insight Lectures. He and a buddy set up a poetry booth at Art in the Vineyard, It Could Be Verse, composing spontaneous sonnets and occasional poems for a nominal fee. Truly, one of the best evenings I can recall is when he treated some of us to a recitation of Mistral's epic poem, which he is translating from the Provençal. He instigated annual medieval poetry readings that were fascinating and loads of fun. In fact, his performance of the rhyming poem from the Exeter book still romps in my head. So I guess Jim Earl is inside my head. And I didn't even have to use a knife. Please welcome my thoughtful colleague into your heads tonight.
Wasn't brief. That's the last time I'll ask you.
It was true, though. So the other part was 50%.
Some of it is true. I want to do a couple of housekeeping tasks first. I have these postcards, which are the fall offerings of the Insight Seminars, and I'm going to put them in the back, so if you want one, just make sure. If you haven't gotten one already, be sure to take one. And I also want to, if I leave this till the end, it'll get forgotten, so I'm going to mention that we have 2 more of these Monday night lecture discussion coming up. In 2 weeks, we'll have some of you who were in the India seminars know that Sister Shirley Matthew is coming, and she is going to speak on, for those of you who have read the novel God's Small Things, she'll be speaking about her work with the untouchable communities in South India. And 2 weeks after that, Harry Bonham, who's our chair of the English department and our Mark Twain scholar, will be talking on the whitewashing episode, the fence, whitewashing the fence in Tom Sawyer. He'll be talking about Mark Twain too. That's a month from now. So I don't want you to forget that these do go on a regular basis. But tonight's talk and discussion is going to be about Arabic love poetry. And I am way in over my head this time. A couple of weeks ago, I was at the dinner table, and I mentioned to my wife and my son over dinner that I was going to give a talk on Arabic poetry, and they both said, I think in unison, "You can't do that. You don't know Arabic." And I'm here to warn you ahead of time, I don't know Arabic. So I am not speaking to you as an expert in the way that sometimes when you go to a university lecture, you get a world expert on a topic. That is not what I'm doing tonight. Instead, Arabic love poetry is for me something of an intellectual hobby. And I like to speak with my Insight seminars. In fact, many of my Insight seminars are about my intellectual hobbies. And I like to tell people that you too can have an intellectual hobby, very much like this one. In this case, I'm only 3 steps ahead of you guys. You could, within a course of a few months, get to exactly the same stage I am in this topic. And I totally recommend it as a great reading list. And it's also, this tonight, a preview of the seminar I'll be offering next month on what we call the culture of tolerance, that is Muslims, Jews, and Christians in medieval Spain. So this is a preview of that, and this poetry that I'm going to talk about tonight is at the center of that seminar. I could have spoken on other things. I could have spoken as well on Hebrew poetry, because that is also at the center of that seminar. I chose the Arabic. I'm not sure. I could have chosen the Hebrew. In fact, I know Hebrew a little bit, so I'd be a little, I'd have a little more credibility if I were speaking on that, because I can actually read the originals. But tonight we have Munir Katul from who's been with the seminars for many years, is our Arabic speaker who will keep me honest about the Arabic. I gave you a couple of handouts. This one is actually a little booklet. If you take it and you fold it so that at the top of the front page it says the qasida, then you have a nice, neat little booklet. And the other handout is an Arabic poem, a contemporary Arabic poem that Munir is going to present to us. And we could start with that, but I think rather what I'd like to do is put it to the end, and we'll work chronologically. I put all the handouts at the back of the room on a chair. So people come in, there's hundreds of people going to come in, and they can pick up handouts. If we read that poem now, I think we would all find it charming. And I'm guessing that after reading some other Arabic love poetry, at the end of the hour, we will find it more than charming. We'll find it deeper. We'll find it more resonant. We'll be a little bit in touch with the tradition that poem is a part of. Let me start with an anecdote. I was walking by the bookstore about 7 or 8 years ago on 13th Street, and Russ Carpenter walked up. He had been in the bookstore, And Russ Carpenter, he's one of the co-founders of these Insight seminars, said to me, "Have you read this book?" It's called Ornament of the World by Maria Rosa Menachal. And I said, "No, I haven't heard of that." So he told me how wonderful it was, and I walked right into the bookstore and I bought a copy. And that night, and my wife is here, she can actually attest to the veracity of this anecdote. That night I sat up in my study and I started reading this book. Now I'm a trained European medievalist, and so I thought I had something like a professional expertise on the European Middle Ages. But this book is about medieval Spain, and I suddenly realized that in all of my training, nobody had ever mentioned Spain. Spain was simply not on the European map for a medievalist because Spain was largely a Muslim country during the period that I feel my expertise is in, and I had virtually no idea. So I was very surprised. I got about 100 pages into the book, and I was so surprised, I was so thrilled by it that I actually turned in my chair, I swiveled around, picked up the phone and called United Airlines. And I said, "How do I get to Cordoba, Spain?" And they told me, "Well, you can't." Not on United. But the fact is that within a few months, I and my son and a friend flew off to Cordoba, Spain in December of that year to see what this book had described for me. And shortly thereafter, I offered an Insight seminar, which was largely on that experience of this book and these ideas and that trip. And not only did I offer the seminar, but half the people in that seminar said, "Can't we go to Cordoba, Spain?" So we all flew off to Cordoba, Spain, and we spent 8 days in Spain, and we spent it at the, studying the materials that I'm going to be talking about with you tonight. Now I'm going to be offering the same seminar in November. And I wouldn't be surprised and I wouldn't be displeased if people wanted to go back to Cordoba after that. This book has a number of surprises, not just that Spain was not on my map until that moment, but only a few pages into the book, Menachal unleashes the biggest surprise of all. She describes Islam, and she picks out two features of Islam. One, of course, is that it has an uncompromising monotheism, but the other one is the surprise. And I'll read the sentences. She says, the other trait of Islam is the loving cultivation, some would say adoration, of language and of poetry as the best that men did with the gift of language. Muhammad's revelation, preserved in the Quran, embraced the poetry-besotted universe of his ancestors and contemporaries, and thus ensured the survival of the pre-Islamic poetic universe with its many blatant contradictions of what would become normative Islamic belief. And we'll look at some of these poems that she's referring to. And one of her secondary theses in the book is that if a culture has a contradiction this deep, that is, it has a poetry that it loves, but it has a religious faith which is at complete odds with it. She says this kind of contradiction in a culture almost guarantees that this will be a more tolerant culture socially. And she's building a case for Islam's tolerance of Judaism and Christianity during much of the period that it ruled in Spain. I love the phrase, a poetry-besotted universe. Those of you who were in the Tale of Genji class a few years ago will remember 11th century Japan was a poetry-besotted universe. That is, this is a culture in which being a good poet is your ladder up in society and in government. That's how important it is. It reminds me too, I like to collect cultures like this. Tudor England is like that as well. you think of poets like Surrey, Sidney, Spencer, and Raleigh, you're really talking about important people who were both political stars, social stars, and poetic stars. That is, it was an era when being able to write a good sonnet, a good love sonnet, was a kind of license to be a public personality, a public intellectual. As for the poetry-besotted universe of Muhammad's contemporaries, on your handout, we have a couple of examples. The qasida is the classical form of Arabic poetry. It's a poem that usually runs to about 100 lines. And the qasida has a number of interesting formal features, but I'm not going to really talk about the qasida as a poetic form, just to point out that the qasidas are so important that there's a set of 7 early qasidas by 7 different poets. And these are called the hanging odes. And they're called the hanging odes because before Muhammad pronounced his new faith, the Kaaba, which is the devotional center of Islam today, that black box in Mecca, the Kaaba was used as a spiritual center for all of Arabia. And there was a number of religions that were centered there. But every year they would hold a poetry contest, and Arabians from all over would come, and they would recite their poems, and the winner of the poetry contest, this is legend, but I haven't read too much skepticism about it, the winner of the contest would have the poem woven onto a cloth, and the cloth would be hung on the Kaaba. Today you go to the Kaaba and you'll see Quranic verses hung on the Kaaba. And that's not to say that the Quran has replaced these, but that the Quran, in a sense, now holds that place of honor that these poems once did, and in many ways still do. And the qasida has a typical opening. The opening is the speaker is a man, and he is at a deserted campsite in the desert. That is, in Bedouin culture, the camps move all the time. And you have a man standing at a place which was, until recently, a campsite for some tribal unit that had stayed there. And he remembers a woman that he fell in love with, but she has departed with the rest of the tribe. And he looks at the deserted campsite and meditates upon his loss. Many, many poems begin with this image. I mean, this is a traditional image. And it's an image which, over the centuries, accumulated meaning. I'm trying to think of a similar example in English poetry, and I can't come up with one right away. But it's a situation which is very, very open to the exploration of the emotions and also of social values and of the nature of love. This part of the qasida, which might just be 10 or 12 lines at the beginning, is called the nasib, N-A-S-I-B. I'm not sure what that word actually means, but it seems, in what I'm reading, seems to mean something like departure. Is that right? Do you know nasib? I don't know.
It's fate.
Pardon?
Fate.
Fate?
Destiny.
Nasib, okay. Thank you very much, Vina. A scholar in one of the books that I've been reading says that the nasib is like a catalyst or like a filter through which new aspects or purer filtrations are achieved. Everything that touches the nasib becomes a symbol. And so you see the detritus of the camp, and you see the tracks of the camels going off into the desert, and you know that there is a set of oases that they will stop at. There is a trail through the desert, and there is the image of the woman on the camel crossing the desert now, and he will never see her again. And this becomes a meditation. So here, for example, the first example on your handout, listen to this. This translator, Michael Sells, is universally, I mean, everything I read says Michael Sells is the translator of choice. He's doing for classical Arabic what, say, Robert Alter does for biblical Hebrew. He gives you a rendition which is supposedly closer in its literary effects than we've had before. This is the opening of one of the most famous of the hanging odes. Is what you came to know, given in trust, kept secret? Is her bond to you broken, now that she is far? Does a grown man weeping tears without end for those he loved, the dawn of parting, receive his fair reward? By the time I knew, they had set their leave, all the camel stallions standing bridled before dawn. Camel stallions of her tribe, led in by maiden servants, then loaded, bundles bound in tazidi brocade, while birds hung in the air, plucking at dye streaks and tassels, as if they'd been stained heart's blood crimson. They carried an etruja away. A saffron-scented perfume trailed. Before the senses, even now, her fragrance lingered. I think that's going to set the tone for everything you read in Arabic poetry. This melancholy feeling of loss, this masculine voice is going to recur over and over again. I love the image of the birds as all the camels are packed up and they're pecking at the red dyed blankets on the camels as if they were, looking for blood, heart's blood. I think our speaker almost feels as if his own heart is being pecked by the birds he imagines taking his lover, his beloved, away. I'll give you a second one in the same series. Bid Hurrara farewell. The riders are departing. Can you, man that you are, bear bidding farewell? Brow aglow, hair flowing, a gleam from the side teeth as she smiles. She walks gently as a gazelle, tender-hoofed in wet soil. As if her walk from the tent of a neighbor were the gliding of a cloud, neither slow nor hurried. You hear her anklets whisper as she turns away, like cassia rustling suppliant in the breeze. I think for a reader of English poetry, there's something familiar here, actually. English love poetry from the Middle Ages, from the courtly love tradition and the Petrarchan tradition, up to the Romantics, also focused not so much on the fulfillment of love, but on its loss, meditated on the emotional structures associated with loss, as if a man can only really become a man, as if a love can only really become a love when it's lost. It's the unrequited love is what, most of our love songs are still about that. Now in Spain, several centuries later, the qasida is going strong. But now it has developed, it has several centuries of development and has benefited from Andalusian culture. And I'm going to read the third in this series, and maybe you'll get a taste of what that's like. Ibn Zaydun's Nuniyya, it's the most famous poem of Andalusian Spain. And he opens too with a nasib. Morning came, the separation, substitute for the love we shared, for the fragrance of our coming together, falling away. The moment of departure came upon us, fatal morning. The crier of our passing ushered us through death's door. The knot our two souls tied became undone, and what our hands joined was broken. We never used to give a thought to separation, and now for us to be together again is beyond our dreams. Keeping faith in you, now that you are gone, is the only creed I hold, my religion. Night traveler, lightning, go early to the palace and offer a drink to one who poured me her pure love freely. You recognize I hope you recognize in the European love poetry tradition these same elements, the parting at dawn, the heartbreak, the broken heart. Now, Minikol talks about the blatant contradictions between this kind of poetry and Islamic belief. But I think you can see, even in that third poem, he goes so far as to say, you are my religion. Our love is my faith. And this introduces us to the idea of the religion of love. Now, in the history of European love poetry, this is a huge concept. It enters European poetry in the 12th century or the 11th century in Provence, in the Provençal lyrics. Suddenly there is this scandalous poetry of adultery, of secret, stolen sexual pleasures, all of which is written in the language of Christian faith, and which is, the poems insist somehow, miraculously, on being consistent with the faith in Christ. On the surface, that's absurd, but this is a tradition which goes on for many centuries and has given us a lot of great poetry. I once wrote on this in the lyrics of Bob Dylan, who does the same thing all the time. It's where your love of the woman is a kind of religious devotion. One worships her. One prays for her return. One senses the angelic in her. And one speaks to her in the language, the same language one uses in religious lyrics. If I was speaking tonight on the Hebrew poetry of this period, I would have opened not with these qasidas, but with the Song of Songs from the Hebrew Bible, because there you have the exact same phenomenon of these fantastically gorgeous, sensual love lyrics which entered the religious tradition early and allowed poets ever after to speak in the language of carnal love, of their religious belief, and allowed people to speak of their religious belief in the language of carnal love. It's a word, but I did not choose to do the Hebrew. I chose to go this Arabic route. Minikol says in her book, how thin, she says, how thin the line can be between the seduction of a vital secular culture, of a language alive and powerful enough to speak to God and to a man's beloved in the same language, and the religion to which such a language and culture were so intimately tied. This is coming very close to the central theme of her book, that somehow poetry is at the center of this culture and is the secret of its success. She has two really important theses in the book. And the first of these is that the so-called culture of tolerance that she's explaining to us among Jews, Christians, and Muslims, but especially between Jews and Muslims, was built on, of all things, poetry. Not law, not the things you might expect, not legislation or even religion, but poetry. It's hard to explain in so many words how she goes on to develop this. One must read the book to get a good sense of it. And you must read the great Hebrew and Arabic poetry of the age. Hebrew poets suddenly, in the presence of Arabic poetry of the sort that I've been reading, Hebrew poets of the age suddenly discovered the Song of Songs again, and suddenly discovered that they could use the Song of Songs to recreate, to reanimate a tradition of real secular love poetry. So there was a huge outpouring of love poetry, not only in the Arabic but in the Hebrew, and both of these cultures are going back to these what I say, contradictory sources for that. And the first secular Hebrew poets in Andalusia were actually imitating what they saw happening in Arabic. They were writing qasidas, they were writing ghazals, they were writing in the same forms with the same kinds of rhymes and the same meters, and they were using the same images that they found in the Arabic, but they, in the process, rediscovered the roots of their own tradition. And there's a second thesis in Menekal's book, and that is, and she started this early on. I should have been showing you these things. I think these are important for you to know, and you can look at them afterwards if you like. This is Michael Sell's translation of the Hanging Odes. It's a lovely, wonderful book. If you can get past your first sense of the alienness of these Arabic poems, they are terrific. This is Menekal's first book, The Arabic Role in Medieval Literary History. I think it was actually her developed from her dissertation. And in that book, she develops the thesis that the sudden flourishing of what became known as courtly love in the troubadour poetry of Provence in the 11th and 12th century. And that has always been a mystery in literary history. When I was a graduate student and we read Provençal poetry, it was given to us to believe that nobody really knew where this was coming from. It just like appeared suddenly and transformed European literature. Suddenly you were getting love poetry, and there was virtually no love poetry in Europe before this. And you were getting love poetry of a very special sort, scandalous and extreme, and all of this inner turmoil of the lover. And it gave rise to not only courtly love, but later on to Petrarchan love, and the whole. And now suddenly you're down to Shakespeare and the later poets who are echoing these same tropes for the rest of European literary history. In any case, Menekal sets out to prove that the sudden efflorescence of this love poetry in Provence was in fact due to the influence of the Arabic love poetry that I'm talking about from Spain. That is, in 1064, William VIII of Aquitaine invaded northern Spain. He brings back a great host of singers of these songs. And his son, William IX, was one of the first troubadour poets. And the tropes, as you'll see, I mean, if there's a familiarity in the poems we're going to be reading, the familiarity is probably due to the fact that this is actually, you're now reading, in a sense, the source of the Western love tradition. And it's coming out of what it came as a big surprise when Menekal first propounded it. It's coming out of Arabic poetry. Courtly love and romance is where we're accustomed to these things. Marie de France, some of you have read Marie de France with me, or Abelard and Eloise, Lancelot and Guinevere, Tristan and Isolde, Dante and Petrarch, and most of us first get our taste of this kind of love in Romeo and Juliet. It's a tragic love, it's a fatal love, it's a love of loss and violence. It's a star-crossed lovers. It's a fated love. It's a downer, actually. There's a lot of people have been writing a lot of books over the years on why is the Western love tradition so depressing? Why is it not fixated on fulfillment, but rather fixated on tragedy and loss? But it is. And I think when you trace it back, you can trace it right back to that man standing in a deserted campsite near Mecca and meditating on the Bedouin beloved who has disappeared on a camel. In any case, now we're going to look at a few poems, and I want to look on your handout at the one on the back page called The Religion of Love. Well, actually, I don't want to go there. I want to go to the one that you might have seen in the invitation, which is on the inside. This is the poem about splitting your heart with a knife. This poem, by the way, comes from this little book, Poems of Arab Andalusia. You can buy it in the bookstore. There's a lot of short poems in here, and they are almost every one of them as delightful or more than this one. It was a collection of excerpts from Andalusian Arabic poetry that was made back in the 12th century, and then the manuscript sat unread for many centuries, and then in 1926 it was read by a Spaniard, a Spanish scholar, and he not only wrote a book about this collection, but he translated them into Spanish. And when they hit the street, the Spanish poets of the day went crazy. This was a voice they hadn't heard for centuries, and those translations, they hit Federico Garcia Lorca, for example, and all the poets of what's now called the generation of 27. Is that right? That is it. This is the invention of Spanish modernism, as I understand it. It had the same kind of effect that maybe Pound's translations, of Japanese poetry or Chinese poetry suddenly had an effect, or the way in which those African masks suddenly had an effect on Picasso. This was a moment in Spanish poetic history. In any case, I recommend the book very, very highly. And I recommend this little poem. How I wish I could split my heart with a knife, put you inside, and close up my chest, so that you would be in my heart and not in another's, until the resurrection and the day of judgment. There you would stay while I lived, and after my death, you would remain buried deep in my heart in the darkness of the tomb. When I give that poem to a class of, college students, there's a good deal of disturbance in the room. That's not nice, But what do we say about it? I mean, I'm eager to hear you. What do we say about a poem like that? I mean, what is the interest of a poem like that? Why does a poem like that jump out the way it does? Why would I have chosen, of all the poems in the world to put into my email message, why would I choose that? What is it about that poem, that thought, this phrasing, this form of poetry that is distinctive? I'm willing to actually ask guys a question and see what you think.
It's his religion, the religion of the poet.
It is the religion of the poet. It's not a nice religion, then. It is. You picked up the religious elements in the poem. I mean, it's not as if the poem is contrary to his faith, although it obviously is, but it's simply he forces the issue to make it congruent in some grotesque way with his belief in the final judgment.
Now this poet is Spanish.
This poet is an Arab. He's Andalusian. It has been translated into Spanish and then translated into English.
But is there any tradition of resurrection?
It is in Islam. Oh, yes.
Yeah.
Yeah. No, there's a day of judgment, just as in Christianity.
Same.
Yeah, same thing.
Same.
You go into the grave and you stay there for who knows how many centuries, and then when the judgment finally comes, everybody gets up and gets judged on the same
That's a
day.
different resurrection, in a way. I mean, I was thinking of the resurrection of Jesus.
Oh no, I'm thinking of the resurrection of the dead at the end of time. That's what he's thinking of, yeah. Yeah. Other thoughts on this? Mary?
I think that the contrast between the simplicity of the language and the startlingness of that song makes such a contrast. But of course I don't know what the language would be like in the original, whether this has been simplified. I don't know. Whether you would get the same effect.
Now you know I'm in the same position you are, because I can't read the Arabic.
Yeah.
And I'm relying on the scholars who say that the man who did the Spanish translation, that is Emilio Garcia Gomez, was a great scholar of the Arabic poetry and a great translator. And Anuncia is saying yes, so maybe that's true. And so I take it on faith that the Spanish, and then I have to take on faith that Cola Franson did a reasonable job in translating it into English. I think if he had translated it into English in 1926, it would have had a bigger effect on poets than it has. It's a little late coming in 1958 is when he translated it. But I think when you're in this position you're reading a literature in a foreign language in translation, you have to take a good deal on faith. And in some ways, we're really having our experience of the poem in English, and I always I just have to accept that and bracket. Otherwise, I wouldn't be reading it. So I think your perception is right. There's a startling contrast between the style of the poem and the content of the poem, which starts a fire. I mean, it's like strikes. What else? I saw. Yeah, Linda.
Well, he's addressing what is really in most people's hearts when they're in love is that you don't want to lose what you love.
Mm-hmm.
And so, because it's so dramatic and violent, the image, he's addressing the biggest fear of someone in love, which is losing their love. And he's even addressing, okay, I will get to keep you until the resurrection. You will be with me not only in this life, but forever until the resurrection. And then he's saying, okay, at the resurrection we'll be together. So, then we'll be together till, forever then.
So I believe this too, that this is the expression of a what you might say a blunt thought. That is, I don't want to lose you. Yeah. And much of the best love poetry that we have in English is this way. It's usually, love is fairly obsessive. There are only a few themes in love songs. I love you, I don't want to lose you. Those are two of them. Or you hurt me, or what can I do for you? Or, oh, that was great. There's a number of themes, but there's only so many, and they're all very, very simple. So the trick of writing a good love song is to find a new way of saying something which is very, very obvious and which has been said many times before. That's why I like love songs, because of that simplicity. In this case, he has a very simple thought, but he finds a very new way of saying it. And the surprise in the way he's saying it is that he has to kill her, basically, in order to keep her. He has to kill himself. He has to resort to violence. He has to suffocate her and snuff out her own existence. That's the element in it that so offends the students who read it in my classes. Munir.
To me, that I feel a militaristic element in this, or attitude of there is some violence, conquest, possession. I wonder, I don't know much about Ibn Hazm. I don't know if he was a soldier or not, but it strikes me in that direction. I don't see the tenderness and the love and the affection.
Right. No, and that
whatsoever.
right. That is
travesty to call it a love poem.
It is the trick that he brackets the tenderness completely and just eliminates it, because it's possessive instead. Yeah. But Ibn Hazm is not a warrior. He is a love poet, and Ibn Hazm writes the most famous manual of love in Andalusia, the ring of the dove, or the neck ring of the dove. is a collection of love poems and many stories of his own life from the streets of Cordoba, explaining the ins and outs, the ups and downs, the surprises and the heartbreak of love. I mean, he's really writing the Arabic equivalent of Andreas Capellanus's Art of Courtly Love, which comes out and is deeply influenced by this. That's the book that sort of set the French and the European courtly love tradition going. This does the same kind of thing. He is a tender-hearted soul, and many of his poems focus on that. But he has a chapter on heartbreak, and he has a chapter on fulfillment, and a chapter on courtship, and a chapter on breaking up, stuff like that. This comes from a bad chapter. Yes?
I didn't. Oh, sorry.
Oh, I was just going to say, to me, having spent 3 years in Arabic cultures, this kind of mirrors Arabic cultures in a sense of the starkness, but the hope of a culture. I mean, that's kind of what this poem says.
So you're saying you feel a cultural stamp on it. Mm-hmm. Well, you know, those qasidas, I didn't mention this about those qasidas, but the man who is standing in a deserted campsite then gets on his own camel, which he describes in loving detail for maybe 30 or 40 lines. And then he heads off into the desert, which he describes in loving detail for 30 or 40 lines. And then he tells you his life story, and it is almost inevitably going to be the story of an antisocial criminal. We would call him a psychopath, because he'll boast of the people he's killed, the robberies he's done, the farms that he has plundered, the tents he has murdered people in. And then he'll end up, at the end of the poem, perhaps on a mountaintop, living with the mountain goats, with his long, shaggy hair. And that is the masculine character in these poems is not what you'd call an attractive character from our point of view, but a powerful, violent, masculine type. And you get the sense that since the poems always begin with the nasib, one has the sense that the distractions of love have driven him into this, but the poem actually contradicts that, and he's always been this way. But I don't know that that's because Arabia was replete with men of this type. That is, I'm not sure there's a cultural type. I rather think that it's a poetic type. We know that at least, that is traditional in the poetry to evoke that image of this violent masculine archetype. So maybe that's what's happening there, yeah.
In the Art of the Troubadours, there were some women poets, and
Yes.
there were poems from the point of view of the woman. Is there anything similar?
We do. You make me suddenly regret that I didn't put a woman's poem in. But we do have poetry from some of the women. And, they take the same forms, but they speak back. They speak back to the man. I want to look at the one right below that, called In the Battle. These are nice because they're so short. You can actually read them and talk about them without taking a lot of time. I remember Sulaima when the ardor of the battle was like that of my body when I left her. I saw her slim waist among the lances, and when they leaned toward me, I embraced them. Some of the same violent imagery. Fusing not religion with love, but war with love. Somehow the love is a battle, love is a war, and then by inversely, a war is like love. And there's something suicidal about the drive that he feels. It begins, as they all do, with, she's gone. and it ends with him plunging onto the lances in the battle while remembering her embrace. It's extraordinary. When I read poetry, what I'm after is what I think of as a gourmet experience in language. That is, what I want out of a poem is something I've never seen before, never heard before, never thought before. Like when you sit down at a great restaurant, you want something you've never tasted before, or something you never tasted this strongly before, or this subtly before. I want that kind. So I'm attracted to poems that do something that I've never seen before. And frankly, I've never seen this before. I mean, I've seen things like it before. I mean, I could give you Provençal poems which do very, very similar things, because this came right into the south of France in the 12th century. I also put on the handout on the next page a perfect example of the religion of love by Ibn Arabi, who's a Sufi poet of Andalusia. A Sufi poet, that is, he's doing a kind of mystical vision of love, which will blend with his religious mysticism. So he says, and this is a gourmet language experience, I believe. My heart can take any form. Gazelles in a meadow, a cloister for monks, for the idols, sacred ground, Kaaba for the circling pilgrim, tables of the Torah, scrolls of the Quran. I profess the religion of love. Wherever its caravan turns along the way, that is the belief, the faith I keep. Is that good? It's very good. That the idea of the mystical traveler is the one whose heart is so open that it will be impressed by anything it comes into contact with. There's nothing that it excludes. It embraces everything. And so he describes the heart as a kind of silly putty, a kind of glass, a kind of mirror which simply becomes whatever it sees. And it turns from these traditional images, mostly religious images, and then it turns ferociously in that last stanza to love. Everywhere the heart turns, as the caravan turns, he picks up that same image of the caravan from the qasida. Everywhere that caravan turns, that's where my religion is. It's still that same image of the girl who's out there in the caravan. And then last on the list, I put a poem by Lorca from 1934. He read these poems that came out in the poemas that we've been reading from, and he wrote a divan, the divan or diwan, that is, it's a collection of poems in the Arabic mode. And so he is picking up and reproducing the effects that we've just been reading about. Listen to this one. With all the gypsum of the Badlands, and if you've been to southern Spain, you know that rocky landscape. With all the gypsum of the Badlands, you were reed of love, moist jasmine. With south and fire of the bad skies, you were murmur of snow in my breast. Skies and fields knotted chains in my hands. Fields and skies scourged the wounds in my flesh. That's a surprise. That last line throws you a little bit. But you can see the same sort of themes and images coming here, this turn toward the violent, beginning with that mystical openness and then closing down at the end with almost those lances coming in as he remembers her and all of the things that she has become for him. I wanted to end with the other handout. This, when I did this class several years ago, when we went to Cordoba afterwards, Munir was in the class, and in the last session we had, he brought in this piece of paper that you have in your hand, and he recited it for us in Arabic. And would you do that for us tonight? Why don't you come up here? You can use the mic.
Thank you, Jim. I want to make it clear I'm not a poetry scholar. In fact, I'm a retired neurologist. I was born and raised in Jerusalem and Beirut, but I lived in Eugene for 40 years. This poem is a mawal, and Jim can tell you more about mawal since it's from Andalusian poetry. It's also a song, and we have the recording of the song. I'm going to read it in Arabic, and then I made my own translation because I didn't care for this translation, so I'll read that to you, and it's pretty short. In Arabic now. في لنا يا حب خيمي على الجبل ناطرة تنزورها بليلة غزل راكع الغيمات عند حدودها وتارك النجمات على سطحها قبل في لنا يا حب خيمي في لنا ومزهرية ورد أبيض عندنا ووحدنا بها الجرد على حدود السماء نحن وإنت وبائد غناني هنا. The translation, as I wrote it, and you have the printed version, which is a little different. We have, my love, a tent on the mountain, waiting for us to visit on an amorous night. The clouds are kneeling at its edges, and the stars leave kisses on its cover. We have, my love, a tent we have, and a vase of white flowers we have. Alone in this wilderness at the edge of heaven, you and I, and a bouquet of songs. The singer on the CD is Feiruz, whom I consider the best known folk singer in the Arab world for me. And you'll hear her pronunciation and delivery will be superior to what I read to you.
Can you help us understand that musically as a song?
The lyrics and the song were written by her husband and her brother-in-law, the Rahbani brothers, who, by the way, are very distant cousins of my clan in Lebanon. And the music is a mawal, and you can speak to that. It's Andalusian type singing. And the second verse, I think, will follow. We cut it off, but it has the chorus responding, and so has typical Andalusian version of Arabic music.
That's good.
And this is Arabic poetry, the modern Arabic poetry that I grew up with. That's why I found the violent Ibn Hazm from Cordoba, so foreign, because the modern Arabic poetry is very tender, very caring, very loving, very romantic, and is quite different than the violence form of possessive love that was described in the Middle Ages.
Although I'm guessing actually though that when he says we have a tent, what I don't, we actually talked a little about this before we started. When he says we have a tent waiting in the mountains, you may picture like I first did a camping tent. That is, two kids going off to the mountains and we have a tent. But actually, as I read it more and I was reading the other poems more, I came to think of it as a more deeply traditional image of a Bedouin tent. And I kept thinking of that man meditating on his lost love out there, and the tents that you read about in the qasidas too. I mean, they were packing up from the tents. They were packing the tents under the camels. They will be setting up tents again, and lovers are always sneaking off to the tents in those qasidas. And I wondered whether there was that evocation of an older cultural image in this poem too. But we don't have to agree on that. Do you think that's true though, maybe?
Very possible. Yes.
Possible?
Yes. I wouldn't disagree. I wouldn't dare disagree with you anymore.
I don't dare disagree with you. Yeah. And that's
Well, we are talking of poems that they are tender and loving in Andalusia.
Yes.
Arabs, Andalusians, many of them. But one thing that to me is important is that the Quisiera Rajar mi Corazón is from the 11th century in Cordoba when they were at war. And the following one, the Religion of Love, in Sevilla in the 13th century, it was very different Cordoba than Sevilla because Cordoba wanted to keep the empire going while Sevilla split in many different kingdoms. And then what I like about it is that you can see a progression with Garcia Lorca then at the end from Granada, that basically the Arabs of Granada had given up completely the war just to dedicate themselves to poetry and dias. So it's
Well, once you start down the historical analysis and the stylistic analysis, I mean, there's no limit to how much fun you can have in this topic. There's no doubt there's more and more nuance to be gotten. Why did I choose these particular poems with the violent edge in them? I think it's because I see them as being one of the most striking continuities with the later European love tradition. I mean, Tristan. We heard Tristan and Isolde on the radio yesterday, the opera, and you're like, oh, it makes your blood run cold when you reacquaint yourself with the story of Tristan and Isolde, or Abelard and Eloise, or Romeo and Juliet. I really want that. I appreciate the Arabic origin of the dark element in European love poetry. But we could have had, in a sense, a brighter evening if we'd done courtship poems instead. Yeah. Poems of sexual fulfillment, and there are plenty of those too. But that's all I have for tonight, and we're past our little time. Yes?
Well, I'm just curious about the people who wrote these. Was there a literary class? Were they professional poets, or were they, they wrote this beautiful stuff? And what?
No, it's happened both in the Arab and the Jewish communities in Andalusia. Anybody could write poetry, and there are many stories of sort of amazing success of people shooting out of nowhere to places of great power because of their ability with the language. Ibn Hazm is a nobody, but he is the grand master of the love story and the love poem. I totally recommend these books. You can take a look at them if you like. And if you're there's still a number of empty seats in the seminar. Anybody's interested enough, there's we get a lot more time up close with this topic in November. But thank you very much.